as I was saying, the difference between a rifled and unrifled weapon is the same difference between trying to throw a basketball and throwing a football. You ever tried to throw a basketball across a gym? You can get a little bit of a spin on it, but it's not very accurate. If you tried to toss one, say, from one end of the gym to the other, your accuracy is not going to be anywhere near as on point if you tried to throw a football the same distance. Why? Well, the football spirals, and that spiral helps it fly in a straight line. The basketball doesn't quite have that spiraling capability due to its shape, and so it's easier for it to get manipulated by air currents, or by the precise way your fingers moved when it left your hand. Well, a similar principle applies to a musket ball. Once it left the gun, the musket ball could ricochet off one of the edges of the barrel and fly off in a random direction. It could get easily influenced by the wind patterns, and as a result of it, it just wasn't accurate beyond 100 yards. One historian once said that you'd be lucky to hit the broadside of a barn with a matchlock musket at 100 yards. So picture a big barn, the broadside, that's the widest side of that barn. At 100 yards, that's the length of a football field, you'd be lucky to hit that part with a musket. So in other words, if I was standing up in one end zone with a flintlock musket, and at the other end of that football field was the largest side of a barn, I'd be lucky to hit that barn, somewhere on that big part of the barn, with the musket. Just to give you a sense for what the accuracy level was with one of these weapons. Now, because these weapons were not terribly accurate, armies of the period tended to fight by firing in volleys. So that meant that all the soldiers would line up on the battlefield next to each other and across from their enemies, and they would fire in a line. So all of them would fire together. The idea being that if we all fire at once, it's conceivable some of our bullets will hit something. Now, because it took so long to reload, many times muskets were fitted with a bayonet, which is a blade that was attached to the end. And what you'd do is you'd fix the bayonet on the end, and then you'd charge with it, essentially allowing you to use the musket as a makeshift pike, as a makeshift spear in battle that you could use. I say pike because it's not a throwing spear, it's not a javelin, but you could use it as a thrusting spear to gore an opponent with it. So that's another use of bayonets. Now, bayonets would actually remain a feature of military engagements long after the 7 Years' War. In fact, we have bayonet charges mentioned in World War II, and I think an English or a Scottish regiment used a bayonet charges late either as Desert Storm or the war in Iraq, just to give you a perspective. So it's not entirely unheard of, even in truly modern warfare, for a bayonet to be used, but they're far less common now than they once were. But in that time period, bayonets were amazingly popular because of the way these weapons worked. Now, what's some big weapons? So, cannons. So a cannon works on the same physical and chemical principles as a musket. You're using a charge, using a flame, to ignite the gunpowder and push the projectile out of the gun. Now, in the case of a cannon, rather than using a flintlock mechanism, you use what's called a slow match, which is a slowly burning fuse, a slowly burning piece of rope, and you insert into the rear of the cannon, and it would ignite the gunpowder and push the cannonball out. Now, a cannon and the related howitzer, which means a cannon is designed to fire in an arching pattern, that can be turned back so you fire it up in an overall arcing pattern, is connotated by the fact that it fires a solid projectile in this time period. Meaning, the cannonball is just a lob, it's just a ball, a sphere of iron. Now, I should mention, there were other projectiles. There's grape shot, which are small iron pellets about the size of grapes. Some were a little bigger. that would be loaded, a bunch of them would be loaded into a cannon. It basically allowed you to use a cannon similar to a shotgun. You know, shotguns fire a spray of pellets. Well, this was the same principle applied to a cannon loaded with grape shot. And it was good mainly for killing or maiming infantry. You wouldn't be able to break down a fortress wall with a cannon like that, but pointing it at a group of infantry or cavalry on a battlefield, you could kill a lot of people. And that was kind of the benefit. You could kill a lot of people. Now, what about mortars? Mortars work on a similar principle to a howitzer, but they fire an explosive round. So in this case, the bomb, as they called it, the mortar round, was basically an iron ball, but it was hollow and it would have gunpowder in the middle. And it would often have a fuse sticking out, like a little piece of rope. And what you do is this thing was terrifying, because you have to light the fuse, put it into then load it into the gun, into the mortar. It's already loaded with gunpowder. Then you gotta go around the back, light the gunpowder, and hope and pray this thing launches out before the bomb explodes. But they were lethal because it allowed you to basically send an exploding projectile into the midst of your enemies. Now finally we have rockets. Rockets actually take a brief hiatus after these wars. Rockets were kind of on their way out. European powers were iffy on what to do with rockets. By the time of the War of 1812, they're back. But around this time, rockets are kind of on their way out. And basically a rocket works on a similar principle to a moth. Think of it like a weaponized firework. Remember about a year or two ago when protesters at Berkeley threw fireworks at counter-protesters? You remember that? Well, this is kind of sort of the military equivalent of that. Basically, these were short rockets using gunpowder as the propellant, and they would be fired off from some type of platform, often a ship in many cases. And you'd send off just droves of them, and they would come raining down and explode a little bit, little mini explosions, on your enemy. These are the same ones that when we eventually get to the Star-Spangled Banner in the War of 1812, are referred to in the rockets' red glare. Those are the rockets. The bombs are the mortars that we talked about. Now, one last thing with cannons. I should have mentioned this with ships. There is something called chain shot. And basically what these are is you don't see them very often on land battles. But basically they're two cannonballs linked with a chain. And what they're used for is they're used in naval combat, and they're used to take out the rigging on ships. Now, the effects of the war. So, France loses its colonies to Britain or Spain. So, French colonies at the end of the war, like, for example, Canada becomes a British colony. Louisiana becomes a Spanish colony. Now, also, Britain and France are left with crippling war debt. France is facing so much war debt at this point, it is simply struggling to make the interest payments. And this is going to be an issue because both France and Britain are going to be struggling with how to pay off their war debts. And unfortunately, for both Britain and France, their efforts to resolve this debt crisis will end up triggering revolutions. That's why I always like to start our part of the revolutions with the war, with the 7 Years' War, because the financial stressor of the 7 Years' War does a lot to set in motion the American and the French revolutions that later follow.